Let's make sure it's going to go live. Yes,
Sure the Dead Sea won't be around much longer. I keep reading about that, like
it's dropping in terms of water, and I'm aware that the region is suffering a lot of really terrible heat problems. And looking at the summertime, especially, Iraq has come up with some temperatures around 125. And it's been happening repeatedly. So with that kind of thing in that area, geographical region, it's really a problem. So feeding the Dead Sea also is the Galilee, right? That's going down as well. So here's something that's very useful and relevant to our conversation. Let me find Google Earth. I'm fairly certain it's, oh, no, is it in here? Am I just missing it? Oh my gosh, I can't see it. Okay.
What's at the?
Oh, was it there?
The bottom left.
This one is Earth Light. It's a screensaver, unfortunately. Okay, so you see what happens when the computer gets worked on. So let's go Middle East map. And we'll go, gosh, let's go satellite imagery. Oops, I spelled it wrong. Yay. Okay. Let's see if this is enough. We'll see. Okay. Hopefully it is. I don't really want that on there though. Okay, so yay. Is it going to render? Cool. Whoa. Is it rendering or no? This is not going to get clear. Oh, let me see if I can get a better image. Oh, wow, it does. Okay, I'm in some weird program. Okay, I'm sorry. Yay, this is what I wanted. This is going to be funny on the recording. I see. Okay. So if you look at this image, you'll see the Dead Sea here and part of the Dead Sea, yes? And then we've got the Galilee up here, right? Am I right on my geography there? I think I am. Let's go one more click in just to try and get better. Whoa, that put us all over the place. Okay, so here's the Galilee, yes? So do we notice anything significant about this satellite imagery? Let's see if I can get a little bit closer. Okay, maybe that's too close. I'll go one out. Okay, do we notice anything about these water bodies around them, the land around them? Not like the politics, not the name of them. What do we notice geographically about them or environmentally about them?
And there's no greenery surrounding the water?
Not a lot, right? So this area is really pretty dried up. So that assessment of, oh no, it's like taking a straw and sucking it out of the sand, right? As we go to the Galilee, which is feeding it, as we can even see here, right? What do we notice around the Galilee? This area right here. What about that lake?
It's a little more green.
More green, okay. And do you see anything that could maybe, let's try get a little closer. Do you see anything that we could think of as a corridor? Kind of see that there's a little bit of a green corridor going around this area. Do you see that? In fact, it goes all the way up in here, right? Let's back up and see what it's connected to. Oh my goodness. So this ecological region, although it looks like it's somewhat denuded, but that's a really far back view, okay? It'd be easier if we had the satellite imagery data and we could take a color map and show you what, this is secondary forest versus primary forest, things like that. But essentially, we notice that there's some greenery around here, and we're noticing that there's a little arch here, and we've got some stuff going on here and a little bit here, as you see. Okay, and then it goes up into here. So this is also seen as a corridor. Okay, let's see if we can move this around a little bit. Oh no. Okay, we'll go out. Okay.
Okay, so if you watching this corridor, it's going to come into some of these areas here, across up into area of Syria, right? You see how this goes up this coast? Okay. If we're going to look back even further, you'll notice that there's connectivity of this entire ecoregion. Okay? You see that? So there's some interesting aspects of what feeds into here from this side, as well as what feeds into here from these regions. What do we know is happening in these upper regions that are feeding into this area?
What's the?
Land-wise.
Oh,
What's happening on the land, policy-wise, people-wise, what's going on in that area? That would be northern Iraq, northern Syria, southern Turkey, right? Southern Armenia? No, not quite yet, Armenia.
Let's Kurdistan that region.
Let's go grab this and see if we can. There we go. Okay, so this area is what we're talking about. So we've got some into Syria, some into Iraq, this area, a little bit of Iran, right? This is a big kind of eco-region here. And we've got Turkey, Syria, Lebanon. So this kind of arc here. So what do we know is happening in that area, politically speaking? Conflict. Okay. So now, if you'll look around the globe, we're talking about this in Nicaragua as well, which we know is that critical Mesoamerican biological corridor. We could do the same and look that up here, right? In those critical areas that are biodiversity hotspots, you should be noticing that we have some of the highest conflict of what's going on in the world, right? So notable is that we're in areas of conflict. What do we know about what happened in conflict areas of the Mayagna during the 80s and 90s? Do we remember what was done in their lands? What did we do to make sure nobody survived there? Burnt all their crops to the ground, started forest fires, right? Made it so that things couldn't survive there. So there's a problem in having conflict, war, because we say it might challenge these ecological regions, okay? And make it even worse for our natural environment. And maybe even making it spiral, right? Because conflict begets environmental problems, begets more conflict, okay? So these are some things. So when it comes to talking about did it again. It's hard to do it. There we go. When it comes to talking about the Dead Sea and drying up of the Dead Sea, it is losing a lot of its size, as we're seeing. For example, you can see this area here was part of it, right? You can see some of the remnants of it already. So, okay, good point. Where were we? Right? Okay. All right. Let's see. How did we get on that? Not really sure. Okay. So in terms of conflict negotiation and peace issues, we're having to deal with areas of these ecoregions, and it means that we have kind of a dual interest, right? We've got the environmental interest that we saw even in Kenya, and then we've got also the humanitarian interest, okay? Going along with talking about too much land for too few people, the idea is that what happens if we do give too much land to too few people? What happens if we give all this land? Sounds kind of colonial in the way I state it, doesn't it? Give, we give, right? No. What happens if we recognize the indigenous rights to these areas, which are very large areas for the numbers of people? What is the challenge in doing that? Why do we care about that? What is the criticism? What's wrong with it? Especially in terms of what the state would say. Oh, that doesn't work, it's too much. Why? What's the concern? Question?
What happens if we give all this land, which is considered too much for these too few people? What happens in the rest of the land of the country? What do we then have for everybody else? Less land, right? Not enough is what we're learning, right? So not enough. So because it's not enough for everybody else, we can't maybe justify supporting the land rights of people that are 75% dependent on this much land. Okay, so that's the criticism, is that we have problems for everybody else, right? So then we're led to the discussion, well, if we're gonna uphold these rights because this is the right thing to do, these are their lands, right? We're just gonna have to figure it out so that we can assert their rights. Then that means coming up with some other kind of a question for the rest of the human race. In other words, it's, well, how much land is available for everybody else? Not to mention for nature, right, that kind of weird nebulous category. But like for everybody else, how much land is then dedicated to feed the rest of the world, right? Remember the tragedy of the commons and Garrett Hardin? And he said, hey, if we don't start coercing people on this, we're going to run into huge problems. And we will have a tragedy of the commons where we make it so that none of us can survive, right? So if we're not asking these questions about how much land, we should at least be asking the question of what does everybody deserve in terms of human rights, right? We said food, right? We said shelter, all those kinds of different things. So among these conversations about indigenous land rights, we have this other side conversation of what about non-indigenous populations and what do they have the right to, right? Especially with changes that are being seen. Did we see anything in the news this week about changes in the environment that we're seeing now? Any new thoughts on our state of the world? Do we see anything? Nobody saw anything. There's a report about the ice cores. Do you know what I'm talking about? Came out in Science. Okay, so it's good to just like throw your email in there and they'll just like give you the top news and you can see at least the top categories. You can read it online in the library system. But we've done further detailed ice core drilling and we believe our northern ice areas are going to melt much faster than we originally thought. Okay, so all of a sudden we've updated our models and we believe it's going to melt a lot faster. What does that mean? What do we know from our climate science projections about what that means? Yes?
Well, if the ice melts faster, there will be a rise in sea level, which if there's small islands, those islands eventually will go under and will become
small islands, say goodbye.
Some islands have already gone under, but
right.
Other islands that have more of a population, they'll lose their land, and then they become refugees to climate change.
Refugees, right.
The issue of if there's tribe issues or tribe like conflicts, then some nations will not accept them or.
Right, and it's
like
weird
what you do
when you don't have a
people
nation.
want to come in, but then their nations will become overpopulated, and others it's like.
What happens in Florida? Like lots of it, right?
Is it? Like
What about the
somewhere
South?
below sea level?
Some of it, yeah. What about the South? Like a lot of the South, right? We're talking New Orleans, NOLA, that whole area. So we have some direct effects that might be happening as projected by science in what they're putting out in the journal. So we need to keep track of some of this stuff. If this is really what's going on, check your p-values, right? But like, we've got some serious things to plan for. Yes?
The most recent estimate was 15 years.
Was that of the last year or was that the prior year? When were those estimates?
That was 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks,
So,
okay.
yeah.
So you're listening to some of the updated discussions, so great. So 15 years we have? Okay, where are you gonna be in 15 years? Coming out of grad school, getting into your career, right? Right? How old will you be?
34.
34, okay? Or thereabouts, right? So time to think about that. If this is actually what we're expecting according to the science, and the science is valid, not sure about that, not sure about the reliability. I haven't had enough time with the most recent projections, but like we usually do this kind of thing peer reviewed. Okay. I'll take away the idea that one of our peer reviewers was a cat in news. I don't know if you've seen that news. Like, so we need to do better at our studies and our peer reviewing. Yeah. Somebody found that one of the peer reviewers of science was an actual cat. Yeah, that was like somebody just like made it up and it was kind of a joke, right? So I'm saying important to check our science, but like, holy cow, if this is really the case, time to buckle down, right? Because we got 15 years to figure this out. Okay, so, all right. That was a little bit on the too much for too few. How many people got the chance to look at Indigenous colonist governmental impacts on Nicaragua's biosphere reserve? Yeah, I know it was like voluntary, and so you could look at it or not. But I encourage you to use this as maybe a potential reference if you're going to be writing about things like people and the environment, because this says a lot about people and the environment in a real short, small, impactful, kind of powerful article. So I recommend that as using that for references. Okay. All right. So if you notice, out of frustration, I just put the final exam up there. So you're all taking it, so it's not like it's a mystery. Okay. So so you can get started on it right away. But before we get to that, let's go over our reading for this week. Okay. And a few other things. All right. Okay. So a little bit of a discussion in terms of national laws and the legal system and how we're going about supporting things. I do want to bring your attention to this. Okay. If we go all the way to the end, they begin talking about the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations. Okay. Essentially, this is giving you all the background to what happened prior to the passing of the UN DRIP. Okay, and also to what now is our legal structure through which we can report violations of human rights of Indigenous people. Okay, had amazing conversation today with a gentleman in New York. He is the regional Latin American representative for the prevention of genocide. It was unbelievable. I felt like I was going through my dissertation defense again. But it was amazing. So I've got some notes that I wrote from my conversation. We'll go through some of that kind of stuff and talk about what they ask. So it's exciting, right? So this is great background to where we are today. And we've been talking about where we are today in terms of Indigenous rights and law and international law, including conflict. So, all right, let's see. Interesting here in terms of politics, okay? We've talked about international law. We've talked about the UN as primarily being about human rights, laws, legal structures, and courts. And yet here they throw in this weird word about politics. Now, one thing that maybe I might have commented on, maybe I didn't, but one thing that happened was in 2014, when we had Dr. James Anaya as our UN Special Rapporteur, reporter for Indigenous people. We had a number of incident reports that I submitted and that other people submitted on behalf of people in Nicaragua, Indigenous people. Okay, that means we put out the call, said people are dying, you have to come and investigate this is horrible, please help, right? And that means that it goes down on their legal registry as a call to them. When you do a full incident report, it's immediately registered on their statistics as already being a case, okay? So we made the calls and they were legally bound to respond. Okay, so they did that. And the first thing that James and I did was to call the political structures, calling the presidency, calling the Center of Human Rights in country. What's happening? What's been done? And in his call to the presidency, he said, look, we're having some horrible things that are being reported from way up in these homelands of the Indigenous people. Incidentally, they're the homelands where the Sandinista-Contra War started, remember? Right? And he said, we need to come in and talk about this because if we're not going to be able to resolve this, it's going to get real ugly. Not only that, but we've got obvious environmental concerns for the area. Yeah? Makes sense. We need to talk. Okay? So the first call usually is to the politicians about what can be done, right? This is kind of like what we're mandated even in court systems here. You got to go through some kind of mediation or some kind of meeting, right, to make sure that the parties haven't even talked. So we're trying to talk to see if we can talk, right? And in 2014, the UN Special Rapporteur was denied entry into Nicaragua because he was the UN Special Rapporteur. He could have go in now, but not as that kind of responsible entities, right? Because once he goes in country, then on the case it says entered in Nicaragua, went into negotiations in 2014. He was denied entry, meaning, oof, this is even worse, right? So, politics is a first step. If we don't get beyond the politics of being willing to talk, can't even come in country, right? That's like bad news. So interesting that that's one of the first places that we're starting. Okay. Here's another piece of talking about advocates. Okay. So this is what we do, right? Anthropologists, especially. Remember, we talked about the need to respond to calls coming from the field, advocacy, right? That was part of our first number of ethical things that we adhere to. Remember, we had that list that was highlighted and everything. So we're advocates, and what we do also is to meet with human rights officials and government reps, and we talk with them about what's going on for the indigenous people, okay? So did we talk about UNESCO in Nicaragua? Okay, we said that Nicaragua has an area that is considered the homelands of the Mayagna, yes? Okay, and do you remember the name of it? No! Basawas. Okay, standing for the Bokai River, the Sislaya National Park, and the Waspook River, which are the main headwaters and areas of the park. Okay, so this was established in 1990 just as we finished the war. It was like, war's been terrible, now we've got squatters, we need to establish a park, get some rules down, right? And ultimately the idea, because UNESCO was in charge, we had this program called Man in the, do you remember? What we call it? Not remembering, that's okay. Biosphere. Okay, so UNESCO has a program called Man in the Biosphere, and that means that it's their recognition that, hey, when we make parks, yeah, we know there's people in them. And not only that, but we got to work with them. Okay? Now, in Nicaragua, in this case, with the Basawas, their mandate in terms of working together means they have to ensure that the indigenous people that are there are at the table with the federal government in anything that's planned, as well as anything that's planned with UNESCO. Okay? Now, do we remember the report that just came out this last week about what's happening in the Basawas, in the Mayagna homelands? How much percentage was just reported this last week in terms of being cut? Do we know? Did we talk about that yet? Okay, I mean, some of this might be new news. This is why I'm having this conversation with the genocide prevention gentleman, okay? So up until the last 5 years, we were reporting about 17% of the lands of the Basawas, the homelands of the Mayagna, as cut, okay? They were located in some of the core conservation zone, which is awful, right? So they were clear-cutting old growth forests, okay? So awful, we knew about this in the last 10, 15 years, but as of the last 5 years, it began to escalate. As of the last year, it got horrible, meaning we had people told to go and take the lands and squat on them and bring their guns and to assert that these lands were no man lands, even though they were already titled to indigenous. Okay? And UNESCO wasn't anywhere. Okay? The last year, we know what's happened because we've talked about this, right? Oh my gosh. Over the weekend, we had another brutal thing of marches and people keep being gunned down. Again. Okay, so it's not over. We're still stuck in this junk. And in the middle of that, UNESCO, all of the staff of the United Nations in a country is staffed by in-country people. Did you know that? Interesting. Okay, so they're not foreign people coming over to work in the country. It's chosen from the national population. Okay, so over the last year, all of them were fired, and all of them were replaced. Okay, replaced by people that were appointed by Ortega. Okay, now UNESCO is not taking any measures whatsoever to ensure that the indigenous people are being treated well, have a voice, or are even protected. Last week, they reported 70% of the forest has been cut. 70. We went from 17% to 70%. I mean, that's like, did I hear that right? Almost, right? It sounds like unbelievable, okay? That means that we're now down in the UNESCO offices complaining. We're complaining, we're saying, hey, maybe we should even sue UNESCO for establishing this reserve, saying that they had to help with the rules and management, and then failing to do anything with it. Okay, so this is one of the considerations that we're taking a look at. So right now, my staff and others I'm working with are in the UNESCO offices as advocates reporting that their current policies under the UN are very unhelpful and they're challenging the human rights of the indigenous people. Wow, it's mind-blowing, right? Algeria at one point sued UNESCO for their failure to protect a sacred site. By naming it a sacred site under UNESCO, it was flooded with people and the site was destroyed. Okay, so we have some interesting things to negotiate with these kinds of entities even. Okay, all right, let's see. We have a list here, okay, of basic human rights that we have international agreement with. Okay, some of this is not totally upheld, obviously, right? And we have some disagreement and arguments about how some of these things are measured, right? Okay, but these are some of the main bases that we have in terms of our respect for human rights, just general human rights, okay? Now, what you should know about the rights of indigenous people is that they're completely new, okay? We had a group that was formed for the prevention of problems that were targeting minority groups, okay? So we have a UN group for minorities, okay? So those that are considered minorities, and they have a definition for that. But in these terms, we had to separate them out aside and call them a peoples. And notice that their rights weren't, while they had individual rights, their rights are considered collective. Right on here they say group rights, but they're considered collective. So it gets a little bit complicated when you say indigenous people have collective rights to their land. What does that mean? I mean, yeah, they have customary places where they'll go for using their family lands, which are respected under customary law. But in terms of tradition, they have legal rights under our Western legal court system to all of everyone's land as a group. Okay. For that reason, we broke them into territories which were clan-based or more family-based. Okay. And you'll notice that the territories coincide with the different languages, like the Bawika that only have 5 speakers, they have an entire territory. The U School that have an unknown language, they have their own territory. So the clan bases also coincide with the language differences, right? Okay. So first time we ever had something called group rights, okay? And then redefine that as collective rights. If you also look at a couple of other comments, again, remembering that this was written in the 80s. Let's see here. Oh, I lost. Hold on. Oh, there it is. I couldn't tell that it was a paragraph that was ending. Okay, so right here we have a reference to self-government, right? And then we also have a reference to determining, let's see. Okay, wait a minute. Here we go. Okay, so self-government and the right to maintain communal ownership of land and resources, right? As groups, peoples, communities, tribes, and nations, not just as individuals. So that's kind of our explanation in terms of group rights right there. Okay, so for those of you guys that are looking for that definition there. All right. Very, very interesting right here. So remember that we had a gentleman that went around the world to investigate how every different area of the world, geographically speaking, defined what it meant to be indigenous. And when he came back, he said, okay, we're going to put together some kind of a definition that's a working definition so we can have some general reference to who is a part of these international law rights and who is not a part of these international law rights. So this is kind of some of the beginning of this, all right? Common history, okay? Racial ethnic ties, that one has been a little bit changed in terms of how they describe it. Cultural or linguistic ties, so now they say a distinct language, right? Religious or ideological ties, here they say distinct religion. So they took the language from something that was a little bit more cloudy and made it real specific. Common territory or geographical location, they kept that the same. Economic base, they made reference to just having a common socioeconomic form, like a way to interact as in terms of a market or something like that, okay? Sufficient number of people, right? So not going to work if there's only two, right? Okay. Let's see here. You have a mention of something called Convention 107. If you remember when we talked about international law, we made reference to ILO Convention 169, okay? And we said that it was rewritten from what was there prior. So 169 updates this Convention 107. So if you remember the discussion, I just want to point this out because it's all kind of summarizing everything we've learned. We said in the first International Labor Organization document that said something about tribal or ethnic peoples, their whole orientation was on assimilation. Do you remember this conversation? Why did we try and assimilate indigenous people under international law prior to the 1980s? What was the claim? Like the claim was, it was their human right to be assimilated. Why did we claim this? What was the idea? It's mind-blowing when you think about it. Why would we say such a thing? Yay, assimilation. Any ideas? Remember, the thinking was by assimilating them, we give them the same kind of life chances that we give everyone else. So it wasn't a respect for their distinctness. It was let's help them be like everyone else so that they have the same kind of life chances. Okay, all right, I can see that, but like still, this is awful, right? Okay. So in 1989, we rewrote that. And then said, no. What we mean is we want special protections for these people, and that means not assimilation. That means we need to protect their special, unique character.
And not only that, but having their unique character, every single one, out there in the world